But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come out to dinner with you to a very fancy restaurant, order a ton of food, wolf it down, and before the check arrives, say you need to go to the bathroom, but just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent. And there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent, and she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees, and she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up, and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Shh," and she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent, and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention and she stops digging and she stands up slowly and she turns around and faces them, and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal. And they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, why are you yelling at me? And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just keeps coming back to their site, and they don't know what to do about it, so they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights, and they decide, we're just gonna stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours, they're getting cold, they're super tired, the woman's nowhere to be found, and so they finally say, you want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone. They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In 2015, an experienced outdoorsman named Bob, along with his wife, his young daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Oregon. When they arrived at the site, Bob began setting up the big family tent for everyone to sleep in, and his daughter said, hey, do you mind if I sleep in the spare 2-man tent that we always bring with us? Bob and his wife deliberated for a minute, but said, you know what, that's fine, but you gotta bring Guts. That's one of the German shepherds. Guts needs to sleep with you because he's gonna be your protection. So that night, after some s'mores around a campfire, Bob's daughter, along with Guts, retreat to their 2-man tent, and Bob, his wife, and Leah, the other dog, retreat to their tent. That night, Bob wakes up suddenly to what sounds like footsteps outside of his tent, and he looks to his side, and his wife is still in the tent with him, and so is Leah, the other dog, and he listens really closely, and he can hear his daughter is snoring, and he can hear the sound of Guts breathing. So his whole family is accounted for, but he still hears these footsteps, and they don't sound like light little scampering sounds like you might expect from a squirrel or some small critter. They sound heavy, like a big creature is roaming around their campsite. But Bob's dogs are really keyed in to protecting their family, and since Guts and Leah are not up going crazy about whatever's out there, he figures, you know what, it's gotta be an elk or something, and it's not gonna do anything to us, so Bob ultimately just goes back to sleep. The next morning, Bob gets up, and everybody's just fine. There's no sign of any intruders in their campsite, and so that only confirms to him that, yep, it was just some harmless animal kind of walking around the wilderness, because we're in a pretty remote area. That morning, they decide to go for a walk down the road that was right next to their campsite. And so they take the dogs, they start walking, and they make it a couple hundred feet down this road when all of a sudden Guts sees something or hears something and takes off sprinting down the road and turns down this little access road that branches off of the road they're on into the woods. And Bob is thinking, oh no, there's a campsite down there and this big German shepherd's gonna bound up on them and something bad's gonna happen. And so Bob, his heart's racing, he starts taking off after Guts. He goes down the access road and he finds Guts stopped right outside of a campsite. But there doesn't appear to be anybody in the campsite. But there's a tent, there's a cooler, there's a table, there's all the things you would expect at a campsite, just no people. So Bob runs up and he grabs Guts and he yells out reflexively, hey, I'm really sorry, he's totally harmless, I don't know what he saw, hey, we're leaving. But then before he leaves, he realizes on the tent there's this big scratch through it, like it's been cut open. And curiosity gets the better of him, and so he kind of walks up, keeping an eye out in case he's wrong and there are people still here. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's definitely no one here. This site is abandoned, because he's looking around and all of their stuff has just been ransacked. There's scratch marks on everything, like animals have clearly come through here. And Bob, who is an avid outdoorsman, he knows how much some of their equipment cost. And he's thinking, why would anyone abandon this really expensive tent or this really expensive cooler? And as he's thinking about that, he turns and he sees there's a propane tank, a solid metal propane tank that has been completely flattened. But there's no tree that's fallen nearby. There's no source. There's no way that could have been flattened. So he's definitely unsettled by this, but ultimately he decides, you know what? I'm gonna take my family, go back to my campsite. I'll just call the park rangers. They can come down here and they can figure out what this is. Later that afternoon, Bob and his family are back at their campsite just a couple hundred feet away from this abandoned campsite. And at one point, his wife gets up to go use the bathroom. She walks about 70 feet away behind a tree and she squats down. And then all of a sudden, she gets up and starts running back towards camp. And Bob sees this. He turns and sees her running towards him. At the same time, Guts gets up and starts sprinting towards her. And so Bob's thinking, what the heck is going on? Bob turns to his daughter and says, stay right here with Leah. And Bob gets up and starts running towards his wife. And Guts at this point has run to his wife and past his wife. Guts has run way into the woods. And as Bob is running up to his wife, he's like, what's going on? Why are you running? What's going on? And she says, I don't know. I just had this horrible feeling someone was watching me. And when I turned, I already saw Guts running towards me and it scared me. And so that's why I'm here. And he's like, look, go with our daughter and with Leah. I'm going to see what's going on. And so his wife leaves and Bob draws his pistol and he starts walking out towards where Guts has now stopped. Hair raised, growling, it's yapping and barking at something in front of it. And Bob's looking and he can't see anything. And finally, after not being able to figure out what the heck is going on, he just takes Guts and goes back to his campsite. When Bob got back to his campsite, he wanted to leave. And his wife wanted to leave. His daughter didn't really know what was going on, but the attitude was, we want to leave. However, it was getting late and they had a bunch of stuff they would need to pack up. And it was going to be a real ordeal trying to do that, especially without any light. So they decide, okay, we'll stay one more day and we're going to leave first thing in the morning. In Bob's head, he's thinking, okay, I heard weird footsteps outside. We have this abandoned campsite nearby that's been thrashed up in the flattened propane tank. And now my wife is running away from something and Guts is seeing strange things in the woods. Like there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And he decides he's going to set up a tripwire all the way around his campsite using a rope tied at about 8 inches off the ground, where along the rope would be little pieces of metal that would clang together. So if anything touched the rope, it would make the metallic clinking sound, then it would alert Bob that someone's here. And so Bob goes over to the edge of the site where there's an obvious starting point for this tripwire, and he bends down to tie the rope, and he realizes, oh my God, someone's already done this. There is another tripwire that's already been built around the outside of our campsite. It's just been cut, it's been broken. Like it doesn't work, but it's here. Someone else who was at this campsite felt concerned enough about whatever was in the woods that they already had this idea. Bob didn't even tie his perimeter. He just drew his gun, told his family, get in the truck, and he stayed up all night protecting his family in the truck. As soon as the sun came up, they packed up and they got the heck out of there. Bob is convinced that there is something out there in the woods in northern Oregon that was walking around their campsite at night, that's scaring their dogs, that's stalking them basically and watching them from a distance. And probably whatever is out in the woods is the same thing that caused the previous group to set up their own tripwire. And it's also probably the reason the other campers at the other campsite were willing to abandon their nice equipment to get the heck out of there, because they are not messing with whatever the heck is out in those woods. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear, and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from it. So he besides that, Dr. Guy Garman,
that's gonna do it,
also known
guys.
as
Let
Doc
me know in the
Deep,
comments
was
what you
an
thought of
avid
today's
scuba diver,
question.
and in 2015, he decided he was going to put his scuba diving to the test and try to break the world record for the deepest recreational scuba dive. At the time, the current record was 1,090 feet, set by a man named Ahmed Gaber in 2014. Guy's plan was to go down to 1,090 feet and then keep going to 1,200 feet, and that would be his record-setting mark. But in order to do that, you need a dive site that goes down to 1,200 feet. But luckily, Guy did most of his scuba diving off the coast of St. Croix in the Caribbean, and that area was known for an incredibly deep dive spot. Now, when most people think of scuba diving in the Caribbean, they think of beautiful clear water and amazing coral reef and exotic fishes, and everyone's so happy and it's so great and the water's so warm. And off St. Croix, that was true. But if you continued going offshore about 250 feet, you'd reach a drop-off that's known as the wall. And we're not talking about a gradual drop-off. We're talking about the seafloor going from flat to turning 45 degrees and going straight down 2 miles into a complete black abyss. Now, the only people that are actually allowed to dive into the wall are very experienced scuba divers with all the certifications. But if you're a tourist and you come to St. Croix, you can still scuba dive off the coast where it is beautiful and shallow and warm and there's reefs and fish, but you're allowed to swim out to the edge of the wall. And people report getting out there and standing on the edge of this cliff, looking in the water with their mask and not being prepared for how intimidating it is. I mean, you're standing on one side where behind you is like this tropical paradise, and in front of you is this seemingly endless void where we don't even know what's down there. I mean, we've only explored 10% of the ocean. These deep portions of the ocean we can't get down, so we don't know what's down there. What we do know is that sometimes whales will dive down into these deeper sections of the water, and scientists will be tracking their dive, and when they come up again, after only going down maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet, they'll return with these massive bites taken out of them, because apparently there are creatures down there that we haven't discovered yet that are so big and so aggressive that a whale seems like a reasonable thing to go after for food. And so imagine standing on the edge of this cliff looking out and being like, what's down there? Well, our boy Guy decides, I'm gonna find out what's down there, and I'm gonna do my record-setting dive at the wall. And so after meticulous planning and hiring a support team that's gonna be there to help him do this dive, he, his wife, and his son fly to St. Croix and they get ready to do this dive. Guy had arranged for a line to be lowered right at the edge of the wall that was weighted down by an anchor that was gonna go down all the way to 1,300 feet. And they would put a metal placard at the 1,200 foot mark on the actual line so that when Guy went down, he would reach that placard at 1,200 feet. That's the record-setting mark. He would use a grease pen to mark the placard to indicate, I made it, this is legitimate, and then he would go back up, and that's how the dive was gonna go. And so in the early morning of August 15th, 2015, Guy, along with his big support team, they head out to the edge of the wall. Guy gets into the water along with his son, who's gonna go down with him for the first 200 feet, and he looks up at the support boat and he gives him the okay. He's ready to start the dive, and then he and his son give the signal, they're ready to go down, and they start their descent into the void. As they're sinking lower and lower and lower in the water column, it's getting darker and darker until it's completely and totally pitch black. They reach the 200-foot mark, they come to a stop as was planned, and Guy's son Kip would give his father a squeeze for good luck because they can't communicate, and then Kip would go back up, and Guy on his own continues down to the 1,200-foot mark. Once Guy was on his own, a timer started because it's very important to track how long he's down at depth, and his team was expecting him to be back up at the 350-foot mark in 38 minutes from when his son left. But 38 minutes came and went, and he was not at the 350-foot mark. But even though this is a big problem, Guy had a whole bunch of extra air canisters with him, and so if he ran into any sort of problem, he would be able to continue to breathe air and fix the problem before coming up. It would just mean longer decompression stops along the way up. And since he was tethered to the guideline, they knew he couldn't drift away. And so they just had to wait and hope that he ran into some problem and that he would fix it eventually and then he would come back up again. But he never did. They couldn't really send a rescue mission down to get him because Guy was going so deep. He was the only one that was able to get down there. No one else was qualified or would be able to do it or had the right equipment for it. he was totally on his own down there. It would take 3 days before they were able to get the right equipment that was able to pull this line up out of the water, and attached at the end of it was Guy, and he was deceased. He had drowned. But the really scary thing about what happened to Guy is when he went down into that abyss, he had all these extra air canisters attached to him. And so presumably he went down the line, probably all the way down to the record-breaking mark, and then he got trapped somehow. And as he's trapped on this line in total darkness, surrounded by who knows what down there, probably for several hours, he just cycled through his backup air canisters wondering, am I gonna run out of air and drown? Or am I gonna get attacked by some animal down here? There is this tiny little stream that winds its way through a forest in Yorkshire, England called the Bolton Strid. It's not very wide, you could jump over it. It doesn't appear to be very deep, it looks like maybe a foot or two, and it's not moving very fast, but that's all an illusion. There are signs up all over the place that say do not go near the Bolton Strid, it kills people. Because just beneath the surface of this seemingly tame water body is a natural booby trap that has a 100% mortality rate, meaning every single person that has ever stepped foot in the Bolton Strid has died. In 1998, Barry and Lynn Collett were walking along the Bolton Strid on their second day of their honeymoon, and all of a sudden a torrential downpour starts just raining down on them, and the rocks they were on suddenly got pretty slick, and Lynn slips and falls into the Strid. Barry, being a good husband, runs over to try to save her, and he too falls into the Strid. A man named Desmond Thomas was on the other side of the Strid, and he saw Barry as he was running for his wife, and he saw him fall in, and he watched Barry's face as he was looking at him as if he was going to stay afloat at the top. Desmond said it looked like someone came up and grabbed his leg and yanked him under the water, and he didn't see him again. Lynn's body was found 6 days later in West Yorkshire, and Barry's body was found over a month later, 10 miles downstream. In another case, in 2010, an 8-year-old boy named Aaron Page was playing by the Bolton Strid for his birthday. There's an area that's totally safe, that's away from the Strid, where people have picnics and that kind of thing. And he came down to the edge of the Strid and was running on the rocks, and he slipped and he fell in. Now, an adult saw this happen and they ran over and they were able to grab onto him while he's in the water. But the pull from inside the water was so strong that this person couldn't hold on to this child, who was eventually sucked under and dragged away and drowned. And beyond these two reports, there's dozens of others of people trying to jump over the Strid and falling in and drowning. So why is the Bolton Strid so deadly? If you look at this picture, this is of the River Wharfe, and it's just a little ways upstream of the Bolton Strid. And all this water in the River Wharfe gets funneled into the Bolton Strid. And the way it fits through that narrow section that is the Bolton Strid is the river turns on its side. So when you're looking at the Bolton Strid and you think, oh, that's not that deep. Well, it is that deep. It's at least as deep as the River Wharfe is wide. And if you look at it on the surface and you say, oh, well, the Bolton Strid's not moving very fast. Well, that's because underneath the surface, there is a whipping current. And in fact, the current that runs through the Strid is so strong that if you were standing on one of the rocks overlooking the water, you're looking down into the Bolton Strid. Well, you're not really standing on solid rock. You're kind of standing on a ledge. You just don't know it because the water meets the edge of the ledge. Underneath the rock you're standing on, the water has completely carved it out. So if you were to fall in, before you get sucked under the water, you would get sucked against the side and you would disappear under one of those shelves and go way far back underneath these rocks. And then you'd get sucked under and drown. And a lot of people who fall into the Strid, they don't make it out the other side. They don't get downstream. They get pulled into all these different caverns and tunnels that have been carved out by that current, and they're trapped in there forever because no one's going in to retrieve them, not even with scuba gear. Because if you get in there with scuba gear, the current will push you into these different caves and you aren't getting out again. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal. And so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search is launched for them, but they can't find them. And after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Maroro's proximity to Howland Island, everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017, when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Maroro Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake, because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Maroro Island, and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that. And so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream. And there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Maroro Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle. And there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Maroro Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Maroro Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Maroro Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell, and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Maroro Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs, who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Maroro Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs, and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku Maroro on a boat. But you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's so that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. June of 2015, 30-year-old mother of two, Lisa McKenzie, lived in what she called a safe neighborhood in Bridgend, Wales. One day when she was cleaning up her kids' toys in her backyard, she noticed something strange about her back door. She thought maybe one of her kids had taken paint and slapped it across the back door, or perhaps it was even mud. But then when she walked up to the door itself, she could tell that there were two very deep gouges in the door right next to the locking mechanism. Also, the key portion of the lock had loads of scratches all over it. Initially, she thought maybe these have been here the whole time and I just haven't noticed them until right now. But when she looked at the two gouge marks in the door, they looked fresh. Since she did not own a dog and didn't know of any other dogs in the area that might come into her property that could have scratched up the door, she figures, okay, it's gotta be my kids. So she calls her kids outside and she points at the marks on the door, and the kids swear they didn't do it. And they say, I don't remember ever seeing that. That's new. At this point, Lisa has this sinking feeling that someone must have tried to break into our house. But she doesn't want to scare her kids, so she tells them to go back in the house. They go inside and she's standing in front of the door and she's just looking at the marks thinking like, what do I do? And she notices in the bushes right next to the door, there's something silver sitting in the bush. She bent down and picked up a wire that she immediately recognized as a windshield wiper insert because she had recently had to replace her windshield wipers because one of the inserts was missing. She also noticed this wire that was very rigid had been bent up at the end like a hook. And it was at this point that Lisa went from maybe someone's trying to break in to definitely someone just tried to break in. They're using the wire from my windshield to try to defeat the lock. Lisa didn't make much money, but with the money she did have, she went out and got the most expensive, sophisticated surveillance camera that she could put on the back of her house to monitor that back door. And in addition to the camera, starting that night, Lisa began compulsively checking every door, every lock, every window, everything that could secure the house. She would check 3, 4, 5 times before going to bed every single night. And then the next morning, she would get up and she would review the footage from the night before. And for the next several weeks, no one tried to break into her house. There was no suspicious activity recorded on the camera. Everything was normal. Until Monday, July 13th, when she woke up and noticed her back gate, not her door, but the gate leading into her yard, was slightly open. Now, because she was obsessively checking every door, every window, every lock, that included that gate. Meaning the night before, she had triple checked that that gate was shut and locked. So for it to be open right now meant something had happened the night before. And so without even going outside, she goes right to her security camera footage, and she would say that what she saw made her physically ill. Earlier that morning at 1:15 a.m., an unknown man wearing a rain jacket and gloves walks up to the back of their house and puts his hands and his face right up against the window and starts looking in the window. And then he steps back, pulls a flashlight out, and starts looking in the kitchen with his flashlight, just brazenly looking in the house. And at some point, he puts the flashlight down and looks up and clearly notices the camera that she has installed. He looks at it for a minute and then just kind of shrugs and goes right back to shining his light into the kitchen before going around to the door itself and trying the door and fidgeting with the door to open it. It was locked. He goes to the window. He tries to open the window. It's locked. And he would make his way down the side of the house trying to open all of the windows until walking around to the back side of the house where there wasn't a camera. And then when he couldn't open any of the windows or doors because Lisa was diligent about locking everything, he must have just given up and left. Lisa's horrified. She gets in touch with police. She shows them the footage, but unfortunately, his face was kind of obscured in the video, and so they were never able to identify him. Here are the highlights from Lisa's security footage. On September 8th, 2017, 19-year-old Kanika Jenkins, along with her 3 friends, were driving to the Crown Plaza Hotel in Chicago, Illinois. It was a Friday night, and the girls had been invited to a big birthday party on the 9th floor of the hotel. They arrived at the hotel around 11 p.m., and by the time they got up to room 926, The room was packed with their friends, the music was loud, and the drinks were flowing. A few hours into the party, a witness would tell police that when they went up to give Kanika a hug, she could barely stand, she was so intoxicated. Another witness said when everybody was up, dancing and having a great time, Kanika was sitting on the side of the room, apparently too drunk to even stand up. At about 3 a.m., Kanika and the 3 friends she had showed up with decided it was time to leave the party and head home. So they make their way into the hall, security cameras would pick them up in the hall, they go down to the lobby, and that's when Kanika realizes she doesn't have her car keys or her phone. Her friends, who were not nearly as intoxicated as Kanika, told her to stay in the lobby. They would go back up to the hotel room and look for her things. Her friends go back upstairs, they search the room for a few minutes, and they finally find her purse that had her cell phone and her keys in it. They go back down to the lobby, and Kanika's not there. Now, they assumed she must have already left the hotel and was waiting at the car for them, but when they got to the car, she wasn't there. So they all pile into the car and they call Kanika's mother and they say, hey, we just left this party and I think everything's fine, but we can't find Kanika and we have her phone and we have her keys. And they explained that they had left the party and she'd lost them and that she was down in the lobby and now she wasn't here anymore. And Kanika's mom wanted to know, were you guys drinking? And it was clear the friends were a little bit cagey about it. And they said, oh no, maybe a drink or two, but I'm sure she's fine. Everything's just fine. And Kanika's mom just felt like there's something off here. It's the middle of the night. You don't know where my daughter is. And so she said she was coming to the hotel and she was going to find Kanika. Kanika's mom arrives at the hotel around 5 a.m. And the first thing she does is she goes in and talks to the front desk manager and says, hey, my daughter was here. They were having a party up on the 9th floor and her friends can't find her. I'm sure she's fine, but would you mind using the security footage to show us where she went? Because we don't know if she left the hotel or if she's still here. Would you mind showing us the footage? And the hotel was totally unhelpful. They were like, well, we can't show it to you unless there's an official missing person report, which, by the way, is a complete fabrication. That's not true. They could have showed it to her. They just didn't want to. And so they told her, sorry, you're going to have to file a missing person report. And so obviously Kanika's mother is very frustrated and she just wants to find her daughter. So she leaves the hotel and she calls police. And she asks them, can you please come down to this hotel and get them to show us the security footage because we can't find my daughter. The police were willing to help, but they viewed this as, your daughter was at a party, she's probably with her friends somewhere, she's bound to show up, she probably went to another room, and they advised her that she should just wait a couple of hours, see if your daughter turns up, and if she doesn't, call us back. Kanika's mom is now doubly frustrated that there's no one who's going to help her, and so she decides that she's going to search for her daughter on her own. And so she goes back into the hotel and she goes up to the 9th floor and she begins going room to room, knocking on every single door and seeing if Kanika is inside or if anybody knows anything about Kanika. And so for hours, her mom goes room by room, floor by floor, and is getting nowhere until at 1:15 p.m., this is now 10 hours after Kanika left the party and vanished, the hotel finds out Kanika's mom is going door to door and they call the police on her and say she needs to leave. She's trespassing now. Police show up to deal with Kanika's mother, who sees the police and says, can you please just ask them to show you the security footage? My daughter's been missing for 10 hours now. I have her phone. I can't get in touch with her. And the police say, okay, fine. They go to the front desk. They say, show us the security footage. They show them the footage, but it's just the exits of the hotel. And they see Kanika going inside, but they don't see anybody leaving. And I guess that was enough for the police and the hotel. And they said, hey, we did our job. She apparently is still in the hotel somewhere, but we can't help you anymore. And no one looked anymore at the footage. And so Kanika's mom is once again now not even allowed to be in the hotel and no one's reviewing the footage. And so she's got nothing she can do. Police would go back though that night at 10 p.m., so 17 hours after Kanika has gone missing, to review the footage again. And they start sifting through other footage beyond just the exits. And they discover Kanika stumbling through the hotel at 3:20 in the morning. She leaves the lobby and makes her way downstairs to the basement. She walks down the hall and can barely stand, and she goes into the kitchen. And then when she's in the kitchen, she kind of stumbles through the kitchen and then vanishes out of sight. When the police are not able to see Kanika on any other camera after she goes into the kitchen, they decide to just go down to the kitchen and look for her in there. And so at 12:48 a.m. on Sunday now, this is almost 24 hours after she's gone missing, they discover Kanika. She had stumbled into a walk-in freezer that was left open for reasons we don't know, and then once inside, she had accidentally shut the door, but she was too drunk to open it up again, and she froze to death. Although Kanika's death was ultimately ruled an accident, One could make the case that had the hotel allowed Kanika's mother to review the footage just 2 hours after Kanika went missing, perhaps she would have found the footage that led them to the kitchen. They could have gone down and found her before she froze to death, but we'll never know. Here is the final footage of Kanika stumbling through the hotel before she ultimately landed in the freezer. In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. Shortly after, he admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. Both had a deep interest in biblical prophecy, and Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. The two did not have a romantic relationship at all. It was strictly platonic. They bonded over a desire to ascend to a higher level of existence and ultimately reach the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tela, or the evolutionary level above human. There was a catch though. Anybody on Earth who did not get on the UFO whenever it got here would be recycled, i.e. destroyed, along with everybody else on Earth, and then at some point a new human population would grow and another UFO would come, and whoever got on that would be saved over and over and over again. That was just how it worked. And Bo and Peep were telling everyone they talked to about Heaven's Gate that we're already in end times. Apparently there were signs that this UFO is going to be here any day. And so now is the time to join the cult. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult, which meant they gave up their families, they gave up their possessions, they basically gave up everything in their life and moved to Colorado to live in total poverty as they waited for this UFO to arrive. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And Bo and Peep are aggressively reminding people that this is the path, you just gotta stay the path. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985, which really screwed things up for the cult. In their doctrine, it was destiny that Bo and Peep would get on that UFO and make their way to Tela, the evolutionary level above human. That was their destiny. And now Peep has died on planet Earth. She did not get on the UFO. She did not ascend to Tela. She will not get to Heaven's Gate. Bo was devastated and horribly depressed, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Heaven's Gate. But he composed himself and he began to tweak his messaging a little bit. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tela. Yes, she did not get on the UFO. However, the aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, this mere vessel, you'll still ascend to Tela. Basically, he was preaching to them, if you just end your own life at the right moment, you can go to Tela too. But Bo didn't really know what the right moment was. He didn't know what the trigger was going to be. Until 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997. And Bo saw this as the trigger. The UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and for sure, Peep was riding on that UFO, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion, knowing full well what they were walking into. They all had specific jobs of how they were going to clean up the mess left from Group 1. They cleaned it up. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the third group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo, and they did the same cleanup as Group 2. They put the Group 2 deceased members in bed as well, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Bo had given special instructions to 2 of the members that were within that third group to wait until he had exited Earth and take special care to put him in a specific bed, organized a certain way, and then when they consumed their own applesauce and barbiturates followed up with vodka, they should do that in their bed because they're the last 2. There's nobody else to move them. When a former cult member stopped by the San Diego mansion to check in on the cult, they went inside not knowing what they were up to and found all 39 cult members deceased, laying in bunk beds with identical black and white Nike running shoes on their feet with purple shrouds over their bodies, and they were all wearing matching armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews where they would record themselves talking about why they were doing this, why it was important, and what they expected on the other side. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do. Here are some highlights from those exit interviews.
Okay, we have Thursody with us, and I believe that you chose the name Thursody because you want to be reminded of your thirst for next level knowledge. Is that correct?
That's right. I know my vehicle's, or this vehicle that I'm wearing, is, pretty nervous, pretty scared. Some may say, well, boy, it's quite a irreversible step.
This isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you.
Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace that I'll probably be watching when you check it out and observe your responses and your reaction when you look at these vehicles. And they're all nothing but containers that we've used and borrowed for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know what you thought of these 3 stories in the comments, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but employ a 6-to-1 peanut butter to jelly ratio. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. Whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya. Stick around for the crazy real-life plot twist at the end of today's top video. Before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please flirt with the like button and tell them they are exactly your type, and then give them a fake phone number. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In July of 2017, Jerome Kennedy was laying in bed next to his wife, and his 10-month-old daughter was sleeping in her crib in the corner of their bedroom. And as he's laying there, he starts to hear what sounds like scuffling sounds above his ceiling. Now, above his ceiling was an attic. It was more like a crawl space because it was incredibly tight, and Jerome and his family didn't keep anything up there. They didn't spend any time up there, in fact. And so Jerome's laying here thinking, man, did an animal get up there? I mean, this is a pretty old apartment building. It's certainly possible that a squirrel or something could have crawled inside the attic, and that's what's making the sound. But eventually that night, the sound stopped and Jerome went to sleep. The next day, Jerome went up into the crawl space and there was nothing up there. But it's a pretty big space, and again, it's pretty difficult to maneuver around. So he thought, it is still possible that there could be an animal up here, but there wasn't any immediately obvious signs, and so he went back down and just hoped it would stop. A couple days go by and he hasn't heard anything in the attic, and then one night he wakes up to the sounds in the attic. And when he opens his eyes, there's a vent that sits at the top of the wall right in front of him that's actually over his daughter's crib, and he could have sworn he saw what looked like a flashlight coming from the attic. Immediately, he gets up and walks over and pulls the vent cover out, and he's looking into the attic, but it's not a good view. It's a curved vent, so at best, you're getting a little sliver of a view into the crawl space, and he didn't see any more light, and he didn't hear anything else, and so once again, he kind of chalks it up, puts the vent cover back in place, gets back in bed, and falls asleep. The next morning, he tells his wife about the light he saw in the vent. And now, they had already spoken about the strange sounds coming from the attic, and she knew that perhaps there was some animal up there, but the light definitely caught her off guard. But then she remembered that next door, they were doing a whole bunch of renovations on the apartment, and perhaps the partition, there was a break in it, and they could be doing some late night work, and light could have leaked through the break in their partition wall in the attic, and maybe that was causing the flash of light. So Jerome knocks on his neighbor's door and he says, hey, I saw a weird light in my attic, and I'm trying to see if there's a break in our partition wall that perhaps if you guys were working late last night, light could have poured through onto our side. Is that a possibility? And his neighbor said, we were not working late last night, and I've actually been up into our attic, and I've checked that partition wall because we're doing renovations, and I need to make sure this apartment is in good working order because I'm looking to sell it, and that partition wall is solid, so I don't think there's a break in it. Jerome and his wife are totally stumped, and so they decide, let's just put a security camera up in the attic and let's see what's moving around up there. Let's see what's causing the light and these sounds. So that day, Jerome goes out, he gets a little security camera, he comes home, he installs it in his attic, and then he, his wife, and his daughter go to bed. That night, Jerome doesn't wake up to any sounds in the ceiling, he doesn't see any lights, and so when he goes to check the footage the next morning, he's not expecting to see anything, but he is shocked at what he discovers. In the middle of the night, after Jerome, his wife, and his young daughter have already fallen asleep, you see on camera as the partition that separates Jerome's attic from his neighbor's attic slides open, and in crawls who else but Jerome's neighbor, Robert Havrilla, the same guy he was speaking to the day earlier about, hey, have you heard anything in the attic? Well, turned out it was his neighbor. So he comes in, he's carrying a drill and a plank of wood, and he crawls very quietly over Jerome's side of the apartment, and then he pulls aside some insulation that clearly he had already detached before because it slid out of the way very easily. He lays the plank down over some beams, and he gets himself positioned over it, and then he uses his drill to drill a hole right into Jerome's ceiling, and it would happen to be directly above his daughter's crib. He'd put the drill back, and then he'd lay there on the plank of wood and stare through the hole at Jerome's daughter for 30 minutes without flinching. After he was satisfied, he got up, pulled the plank out of the way, he slid the insulation back in place, he grabbed his grill and the plank of wood, and he crawled his way back into his side and shut the false door. Jerome calls police, who come over and they look at the footage and they immediately arrest his neighbor. But then when they go up into the attic to look for themselves, they find there's all these different drill holes that have been carefully covered over because their neighbor had been doing this for some time and had developed a sort of awful routine where he would come in and spy on the family, specifically their infant daughter. Jerome's neighbor was found guilty of criminal trespassing and was given 5 years of probation and had to pay Jerome's family $2,245. Here is the very creepy security footage of Jerome's neighbor. Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable. But instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. And eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was like a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says yes. Guns. But when police rush to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and they were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling, she sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You gotta lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're in the other room. And Carol's like, no, there's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers. She apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, like, I feel so embarrassed about it. And her mom, being a good mom, told her, you know what, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good. And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment. And so they hang up the phone and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining. And as soon as she puts her dog down, because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion, except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it. And as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns, and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still, and the dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog, she's abandoned, she's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her, because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill? And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother. And they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her, and how that had actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who are fighting against addiction or depression. And they explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers, and actually the Louder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin. But days turned into weeks and there was no leads, no one knew where she was. She had just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment, and they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They pull her out of the water and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she had been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died, and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she had kind of lost it, well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view, and behind that is this huge forest. And it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more? On June 20th, 2018, 15-year-old Lisandro Gomez Feliz, who went by Junior, was on summer break from school. He and his mother lived in a small apartment in the Bronx, which is in New York City, and this particular night he was staying in, playing video games while his mom was trying to sleep in the other room. Just after 10 p.m., Junior gets a text message from his friend Jason Velez, who lived about 2 blocks over, and Jason was asking Junior if he wanted to come over and listen to music with him. Junior was getting bored of his video games anyway, so he says, sure, I'll come meet you. And then at 10:05 p.m., an outside security camera picks Junior up, leaving his house, walking the 2 blocks over to his friend Jason. Junior arrives a couple minutes later, and he and Jason spend the next hour and a half looking at their phones, listening to music, and just chatting with each other. At about 11:30, Junior says he wants to go, and so he says bye to Jason, and he starts walking back towards his apartment, but instead of going to his apartment, he walks past it towards an area known as Adams Place. Adams Place was notorious for gang activity, and it was just not a safe place to be unless you were in a gang or it was broad daylight. And since it wasn't broad daylight and Junior was not in a gang, this is a pretty risky move for him. But Junior had a very close friend that lived right near Adams Place, and this friend of his was not in a gang either, and Junior wanted to hang out with him. And so as he's walking over to Adams Place, he texts this friend and says, hey, I'm going to be there in a minute. And his friend writes back, don't come here. It's not safe. There's some people outside that are a little bit sketchy. There's some cars in the area that we don't recognize. Like, stay away from Adams Place. And so Junior gets this text message and he's not about to risk it. So he turns around and starts walking back towards his apartment. But at the same time Junior's getting this text message, a security camera picks up 4 cars full of gang members going past Adams Place and turning onto the road that Junior's on, and they start driving up towards him. And as they drive past Junior, they start yelling out at him and taunting him and making fun of him. And Junior, who's scared, just starts running. And right away, the cars start chasing him, and they immediately cut around another side street and they cut him off. And so he's kind of funneled into this bodega that's on the corner right in front of his apartment. He's literally a stone's throw away from the front door of his apartment, but he can't get to it. So he goes in the bodega and he yells for the store manager to let him over the counter, to hide on the other side of the counter. And this store manager, who's used to gang violence in this area, is not quick to want to help this guy jump over. He's worried he's going to get robbed. But as he's kind of holding him back from getting on the other side of the counter, the gang members saw Junior go into this bodega, and one comes flying into the bodega, sees Junior, and immediately turns around, runs outside, and on security camera alerts the other gang members that Junior is in here and there's no way for him to get out. There's only one entrance into the bodega. And you see all the cars converge on this bodega, and you see all these gang members get out with machetes and knives, and they make their way into the bodega, where now Junior is behind the counter, and you can tell he's terrified because he does not know what's going on. He doesn't know why he's being attacked. And you see the gang go right up to the counter and they're screaming at the shop owner to give them Junior. And the shop owner is actually doing a pretty good job of saying, get out. Like, I don't want you in here. Leave him alone. Just get out. But at some point, one of the more aggressive gang members just reaches across and grabs Junior and starts pulling him, and they all pile on and start beating on Junior. They beat him to the ground. They pull him painstakingly out of the store. Junior's grasping at everything he can. At one point, he grabs onto the ATM machine, and you can see fear in his face. He does not want to go outside. But they eventually yank him out into the streets, and they proceed to savagely stab and slash him with machetes and knives. After a flurry of attacks, the gang members all run away and get in cars and drive away, and Junior stands up and he's a little bit dazed, and he runs back into the bodega, and now he's bleeding profusely, and he's yelling for help, help me, and everyone's telling him to get out of the store. No one wants to help him. He goes back out onto the road and he's screaming, someone call 911, and no one's listening to him. People are just filming him. And with what little strength he had left, he just starts running towards St. Barnabas Hospital, which was about a block away, and he makes it all the way to the front of the hospital and then collapses, and he bleeds to death. The gang responsible for Junior's death was the Trinitarios, which is a Dominican gang that was born out of New York prisons, and over the past couple of years, their violence has skyrocketed. There have been numerous clashes between they and other gang members. Lots of people have been stabbed and attacked, just like Junior was. But Junior's death wound up being very unique. After his death, one of the leaders of the Trinitario gang posted to social media that the killing was actually an accident, that this was a case of mistaken identity. Apparently, someone had been disrespectful to a gang member's niece, and that night, those 4 cars were out there looking for him, and apparently they expected to find him near Adam's place, and he looked enough like Junior that they decided that's the guy, and Junior was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The gang would apologize to Junior's family on social media and said they kicked the killers out of the gang, and the 5 people that were responsible for killing Junior were ultimately convicted of murder and given life sentences. Here is some of the footage of Junior running into the bodega, trying to save himself before ultimately being dragged out into the street and killed. Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the signal, although it only lasted 72 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static. And that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that, it transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, as the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past 0 through 9 and made its way into the letters all the way up to letter U, and it held it for 72 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 72 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it, and that signal dropped all the way back down. So when Amon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point. And from that point forward, this transmission became the WOW signal. One of the main reasons the WOW signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrence is because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers, they had 50 of them, and anytime they were aiming their dish in a direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio, listen to music, those are targeted radio waves, meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency, and only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is a non-natural radio wave. The night that the WOW signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others, meaning the WOW signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this WOW signal, It's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused the WOW signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained. There is a taboo that is held in the scientific and academic communities, as well as in government, news media, and all modern institutions. And that taboo is on taking UFOs seriously. As a result of this societal conditioning, many people simply don't believe in UFOs. And those same people will view others that do believe in UFOs or who are open-minded to it as the crazy people, when in reality, UFOs are blatantly real. I mean, blatantly so. And they've been whipping around Earth for some time. But because of that taboo, scientists and politicians, they don't want to do the research to figure out why they're here because it's career suicide. And what's worse is there's all sorts of programs, like I'm going to tell you about in a minute, that are designed to keep people conditioned to believe that everything is ponies and rainbows, and there's no aliens, there's no UFOs, there's no anything but Earth. In 1952, a CIA group called the Psychological Strategy Board concluded that the people in the United States are prone to mass hysteria when it comes to UFOs, and that we should be actively debunking any organization or person or group that is trying to get to the bottom of UFOs or other unexplained phenomenon. It seems like the reasoning behind this was to protect the public from themselves. They did not want the public to discover something as momentous as the discovery of a UFO that is connected to extraterrestrials or some other unexplained phenomenon. They didn't want the public to discover that. They wanted the government to make that discovery so it could be controlled, the narrative could be controlled, and they could protect the public from falling into mass hysteria. Now, while we don't know if the government actually listened to this recommendation and began aggressively censoring any group or organization that was trying to get answers about UFOs, what we do know is that the government at the same time was investing real money to do their own research about UFOs. In December of 2017, the Pentagon had to come out and confirm the existence of a particular program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program after 2 of their videos had been leaked. This highly classified, highly controversial government-funded program investigated UFOs. The 2 leaked videos were filmed by American service members, pilots, when they saw these objects that were flying around Earth that were demonstrating what this program described as advanced physics, which is basically things humans haven't figured out how to do yet. The objects were able to accelerate with g-forces that were too much for the human body to withstand. They could reach hypersonic speeds with no sonic boom and no heat trail. They also seemed to resist Earth's gravitational pull despite not looking particularly aerodynamic enough to have lift or thrust. Metamaterials that came from these UFOs were made up of materials that you can't find naturally on Earth and would be extremely expensive to replicate. According to a Pentagon briefing this group gave in 2009 about all of their research into UFOs, they concluded that the United States would not be able to protect itself against some of the technology they had discovered. And these 2 videos that we're seeing are only the ones that were leaked. And in April of 2020, the Pentagon came out and officially confirmed those 2 leaked videos from 2017 were authentic, and to this day, the crafts or objects that were spotted in those videos are still listed as unidentified. They wouldn't say that unless they made sure it was not just another military craft or some other conventional explanation, meaning, really, we don't know what these things are. Here are the 2 video clips.
Nickel 6-1 Tango, Roger, over. Roger, there's troubleshooting as soon as I get.
Did you box moving target? No, I took an auto track. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, dude. Wow, look at it fly. Dude, this is a drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is the LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at that thing! It's rotating.
Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them, and of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them, scientists now say, are most likely habitable. There's really 2 criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. 1, it needs to be rocky, and 2, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation, and we've detected strange signals emanating from the nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked and in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now, or could be life, is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together. So close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others, and you're so close you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds, and in theory, you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results this month in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 plus planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life. Not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed, that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth, which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone. So that's good. Amongst all the special operations units in the entire world, there are a handful of units that are better than everybody else. And one of them is the United States Navy SEALs. Now, I'm a little bit biased because I was a Navy SEAL from 2012 to 2017, but just objectively speaking, the amount of money that the United States Navy invests into creating one Navy SEAL is approximately $1 million. Now think about that from a military standpoint. The military is like the ultimate bureaucracy, where it's all about kind of mass producing solutions. But with the Navy SEAL teams, it's kind of like the opposite, where this big bureaucracy is spending all this money and time to identify individuals that on their own merits are going to be the solution. And in order to be identified as one of those individuals, you need to go through arguably one of the most difficult military selection programs in the entire world. And if you make it to the very end of the 1.5 to 2 year long process of becoming a Navy SEAL, one of the last things you have to do before you can actually put a trident on your chest and be a Navy SEAL is go through a course called SEER School. SEER stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. They're going to teach you how to handle being captured by the enemy, and more specifically, being tortured by the enemy. Much of SEER school is done in the classroom, but the famous part of SEER school is done in the field. Now, before I get into anything to do with the field exercise, just know that I can't really talk in detail about it because a lot of it is actually sensitive information. So I'm going to be speaking in generalities about the course, but you'll get the gist and you will appreciate the audio recording. After you finish the classroom portion of SEER school, you move on to the kind of final training exercise or field exercise. And that's where they simulate you being behind enemy lines and getting captured, and you need to basically show your instructors that you don't just crumble, that you actually can handle the stress and the pressure and the mistreatment. There are segments of the field training exercise where you are put into very stressful positions. You're sensory deprived, and you have to listen to a particular audio recording. It is the Boots poem by Rudyard Kipling, and anybody that's been through Navy SEER school knows exactly what that poem sounds like, because you listen to it over and over and over and over and over. It is maddening. I mean, maddening. I put it on for this video and listened to it. I had to turn it off. It's seriously awful. And so just imagine listening to this for like, I don't want to give any times away, but it's an extremely long amount of time that you're just listening to this in this tight little space and you're all cramped up. It's awful. It really is. So here you go. Have a listen to the official torture song of the Navy SEAL teams.
We're slogging over Africa. So stand by day because the company, but night brings long strings of 40,000 million boots, moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. Try to think of something different. Oh, my God, keep me from going lunatic. Moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. We're slogging over Africa.
In 2013, a Reddit user was having a hard time getting to sleep, and then they would wake up in the middle of the night and their sleep was just generally broken, and so they decided they would look into downloading a sleep app. She wound up settling on a particular app called Sleep as Android because not only would it give her a whole bunch of information about her night's sleep, but it also had a constant recording going over the course of the night, and anytime it picked up an anomaly in sound, like snoring or talking in your sleep, it would record it and then clip it and provide it to you the next morning and show you these highlights of your sleeping from the night before. So she downloads the app, and starting on October 1st, 2013, she begins dutifully turning this thing on before she goes to bed. And then the next day she would get up, she'd review her sleep, she'd read all the graphs, she'd get all the reports. But the thing she wound up being the most interested in was this little timeline of all these instances where she would snore or make a funny sound. And it was just interesting because you don't get to listen to yourself sleep because, well, you're sleeping. But starting in November, so a month after downloading it, she started noticing that the app was picking up this strange clicking sound. It didn't have a consistent cadence to it. It almost sounded like someone had dropped something on the ground, but it was really difficult to discern it as something specific in the room. And so she assumed it had to be like the string on the fan, because some nights her fan was on, some nights it was off. And when it was swinging, maybe it was rattling the fan and the chain was bumping into the side of the frame, or it was just something else in her room. It didn't strike her as a very meaningful sound, but she was at least starting to be aware of this sound. Over the next couple of weeks, she heard the sound a couple more times, not while she was sleeping, just the next morning when she would see it on her app. And she actually started trying to recreate the sound by turning on the fan and actually shaking the fan to try to get the string to bounce up against the side in hopes that that would be the sound. But despite listening really intently for this sound, she just could not duplicate it and just didn't know where it was coming from. But again, she's not concerned, she's just a little bit perplexed. Then on December 30th, 2013, so this is about 3 months after downloading it, she's had about a month and a half of hearing these clicking sounds, She wakes up and she sees on her app's timeline there's a whole bunch of audio recordings, but there's one particularly loud recording that took place at 2:04 a.m. earlier that morning. She loads it up and she starts hearing those clicking sounds that she had grown accustomed to hearing, but then she hears herself sit up in the bed and say, "What are you doing?" And then there's a pause, and then a male voice says back to her,
"Nothing."
And then you hear some more clicking, and you hear that same voice say,
"That's them."
And so right after hearing this recording, the Reddit user is like, "Oh my God, was someone in my house?" And she runs around the house, makes sure nobody else is there. All the doors are locked, all the windows are locked. There's no sign that anybody was in the house. Nothing's missing, at least nothing she can tell. The Reddit user's friend suggested, why don't you post it to Reddit and see if anybody can give you some insight into what this was. Out of the thousands of comments on there that were all over the map for what this could be, there was a speech expert that actually got in touch with the Reddit user and went through the audio with her and then had her send recordings to him as well as her son to try to see if it would be possible for her to make the voice. And the speech expert determined that it would be impossible for her or her son to have made the voice in the room, meaning someone else was in the room with her in the middle of the night. After this particular night, she never picked up another voice in her room with her, but she did continue to hear that clicking sound that she began to associate with whoever this person was that was in the room with her, and so she and her son ultimately moved. Here is the audio recording.
What are you doing? Okay.
In the late 1940s and 1950s, Reverend Jim Jones was known for his charitable works and his efforts towards desegregating Indiana. This earned him a devoted, loyal following, in particular from the African American community. In 1956, he purchased a church in Indiana and he named it the People's Temple, and all of his loyal followers went there and joined his congregation. During his fiery sermons, Jones emphasized helping the poor and lifting up the downtrodden, but despite his best efforts, raising money was proving to be a big challenge for him. Jones knew he was an amazing performer and he was really good on stage, and so instead of trying to do all the old school church fundraising techniques, he decided to do something a little more new school that played to his strengths, which was performance. And so what he started doing is advertising that he could perform miracles, live miracles on stage. And specifically what he said he could do is he could pull cancer out of people. And he had this magic trick where he would go up to somebody that had cancer and he would appear to be pulling on them, and then he would pull out what looked like meat from this person. And it was meat. It was chicken meat. And he made it seem like he had removed the cancer, and people loved it. And his congregation swelled immediately and money was pouring in. And it was around this time that Jones began to realize the power of his own influence. He could make his followers believe anything he wanted. This power trip, though, over time would cause Jones to lose his grip on reality. And so when he began espousing fairly radical views, he didn't have anybody that was going to stand up and say, I don't know if you're right about that. Instead, he had a mass of people that basically blindly agreed with him. But when his social goals became so radical that they attracted Marxist leaders and violent leftist groups to the People's Temple, it was the one time that his followers said, okay, enough is enough. And there was a mass defection out of the People's Temple. And some of these defectors, when they left and had a chance to kind of look at the People's Temple for what it was, they realized it was more like a cult, and that they had been brainwashed, and that Jim Jones was a lunatic, and anybody who followed him could potentially be in danger. And so they went to the media and told them about this. The media converges on the People's Temple, and all of a sudden it's this huge scandal that Jim Jones is the leader of a cult. And as stories started to break about Jim Jones being this awful person who was stealing from his members and abusing them and brainwashing them, he up and leaves for South America with hundreds of his most loyal followers, and they resettle in an area called Guyana that would eventually be called Jonestown. Life on the Jonestown compound was very grim. Not only did they have 10-hour workdays every day of the week, but food and water were extremely limited because they were so cut off from modern society that the only way they could get any sort of resources was through haggling over a shortwave radio that usually didn't even work. So they're totally cut off, they have very few supplies, and then at the end of their 10-hour workday, it was mandatory for all members to come into this main area underneath this big scaffolding where Jim Jones would get up on stage and he would rant and rave about various government conspiracies that were going to befall them. He would excoriate defectors and talk about how they needed to round them up and make examples of them. And if you stepped out of line, even just a little bit, you could find yourself locked inside of a coffin or trapped at the bottom of a well as a form of punishment. Jones was already spiraling out of control, but some health issues led him to take a daily, near lethal dose of amphetamines and sedatives that made him a total lunatic. Suddenly, his nighttime speeches just weren't enough, and he began pumping these crazy speeches 24/7 over loudspeakers all over the camp. One defector said the speeches were centered on this idea that back in the United States, the government was systematically rounding up African Americans and sending them to concentration camps. And it was only a matter of time before they came here and took any of the African Americans here into captivity. And since the majority of the People's Temple were of African American descent, this was terrifying. U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan had been keeping close tabs on the People's Temple ever since the news broke about Jim Jones kind of being a hack and a maniac. And when they went to South America, he just felt like no one's really checking in on them, and I'm concerned for the well-being of the people that are there. And so on November 18th, 1978, Ryan, along with 18 other people, flew to Guyana to talk to Jim Jones and to make sure that everything was okay. When he arrived, he was expecting it to be kind of in disrepair and be this chaotic scene, but it wasn't. The camp was maintained, people were well-dressed, polite. It seemed like a happy and healthy community with a few hundred people there. And he actually went to Jim Jones and says, you know, it looks like you got a good thing going here. But Jones, in his totally delusional state, believed Ryan was being sent by the US government to round up the members and to ship them into concentration camps. And so as soon as the congressman left the camp and was headed back to the airport, Jones sent a security team after them and they shot and killed Leo Ryan along with 4 others. While that massacre is going on, Jones goes over to the middle of the camp where he normally gives his nighttime speeches, and he calls all 900 plus members to the middle of camp to listen to him. He turns on a recording device, he picks up his microphone, and he delivers a speech that would come to be known as the death tape. His famous first line of this speech is, "I've tried my best to give you a good life." And you can hear the crowd erupt with cheers as he says this, and what listeners of this tape can't see is what's being unveiled at the same time. Right next to Jim Jones is this silver cauldron of this sickly purple liquid, and next to it are about 900 cups. The next day, authorities are outside the gate of Jonestown, and they're getting ready to head into Jonestown to confront Jim Jones about his connection to the murder of Congressman Ryan and the 4 others. And they're loading their guns, they're getting ready for what's bound to be massive resistance from this crazy cult leader and his followers. And as they're making their way down the road and the camp comes into view, they notice that it's eerily quiet and they don't see anybody moving around. And as they're walking through some of the high grass, someone trips and falls, and they think they've stepped on a log. But when they stand up and look down, they notice that it's a dead person, and they scream out, and then everyone's looking around, and they notice that all over the ground in front of them are hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies. There's more bodies than they can possibly count. The previous night, that purple liquid that was revealed to the crowd after Jim Jones begins his speech was Kool-Aid mixed with cyanide. And over the course of several hours, and it's all recorded on the death tape, he encourages his members to come up and die with dignity and drink the Kool-Aid. However, if you didn't drink the Kool-Aid or didn't want to drink the Kool-Aid, like many of the 300 children, their parents would make them or the armed guards would come over and they would inject them with it. And after everybody's died, Jim Jones doesn't even drink from the Kool-Aid. He ends up shooting himself. I've decided to only include a very small portion of the death tape because so much of it is just it's heartbreaking, it's distressing, and it should be something that you decide you want to listen to. It should not be thrust upon you.
How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. It was said by the greatest of prophets from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed. Take the portion like they used to take in ancient Greece and step over quietly, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. We can't go back. They won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen, and there's no way we can survive.
So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please steal the like button's library card and then take out several hardcover coffee table books, but then don't return them. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok. My username over there is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.